Okay, in terms of the stuff, welcome to the February 1st episode of Critical Thinking. And we'll do today is press on some new stuff, finishing up part 1, and then go on to more new stuff, starting part 2. In terms of upcoming work, exam 1, available, due later on. Quizzes part 1, assignments part 1, covering the part 1 stuff. Those available on campus. Before heading to finishing up chapter 4, anything about any previous stuff that needs more stuff. Okay, when last we met, we were looking at the credibility of sources. And we saw that if we get a claim that's worth assessing, we'd want to consider two main things about it. One is the claim itself. Is it something on the face of it we should probably accept, probably reject, or suspend judgment? And to assess this, we rely on, when available, our own observations, also our background information, and then, of course, other credible sources, and run them against it. And as we saw, if something passes our observations, that's a plus, but doesn't guarantee it's true. If something goes against our observations, that's a minus, but again, not guaranteeing it's false because our observations could be wrong. Same with background information. If something goes against it, that's a minus, but not guaranteed false because our background information could be incorrect. If it matches our background information, plus, but again, not guaranteed true. And similarly with credible sources. If something matches credible sources, plus, but not guaranteed truth, then you can see the pattern. If something goes against credible sources, minus, but not guaranteed false, because our observations, our background information, and other credible sources are not completely conclusive or infallible. Now, the second thing to consider is where the claim came from, the source. And if we simply reject the claim based on the source, that would be a fallacy we'll see in the near future called the ad hominem. If we accept a claim based on the source, that could be okay, but it could also be bad. And we'll look at that some now, some later. So we finished up last time looking at qualities that have no relevance to the claim being logically credible, that you should believe it, but are very powerful psychologically. They don't add to credibility logically, nor do they take away from it. So things like how people behave, eye contact, firm handshake, sweaty hands, laughter, person's gender, height, age, ethnicity, accent, mannerisms, how loud they are, how confident they seem. Again, no connection to the logic or credibility. But psychologically, these can be very effective. And of course, as I mentioned before, if you've got, say, truth and you're trying to share with people, it would be kind of foolish to simply refuse to use psychological static. And this does raise some ethical questions, like, is it okay to intentionally exploit these factors to convince people of things that are true? And that would take us into ethics. So, in general, it's reasonable to accept a claim that seems credible on its face and comes from a credible source. And that is a reasonable thing to do. Always keeping in mind that you could always be wrong. Now, some things, of course, may seem credible, but not be credible. It may seem on the face of it be a plausible claim, turn out not to be true, or it may come from a credible source, but not turn out to be true. Again, because no one's infallible. Final consideration, interested parties. As I noted before, this is not someone who's like wow, I find that really interesting, fascinating, it's a person's got a stake in it. Now, why are people who have like a stake in something, they have, to use the metaphor, money on the table, why does it make them less credible? Yeah, they can be biased. So if I own a business and I'm trying to sell you stuff, does that lower my credibility? Yeah, it doesn't mean I'm wrong. I mean, it doesn't mean you should, just trust people because they have a stake in it. But credibility is lower because the person has something to gain or lose. Now, one should not say, aha, this person has a stake in it, so they're wrong. If someone says, former President Trump has got a stake in the January 6th inscription, therefore is wrong about it, that would be bad logic. He has lower credibility because he's got a stake in it. But then again, so does Joe Biden know it. He's got a stake. So it doesn't make people automatically wrong, but having a stake in something impacts credibility. And so you'd want to consider other stuff too. So in general, interested parties have lower credibility, but it would be a fallacy to say this person's got a stake, so they're auto wrong. Or they don't have a stake, so they're auto right. So as I mentioned, if we reject a claim based on relevant qualities about a person making the claim in the source, that would be a fallacy we'll see in the future, the ad hominem or genetic fallacy. What about accepting claims based on people's qualities? Well, that can be bad too, but it can also be kind of okay. In general, this is the authors of the book didn't include this argument directly, kind of weirdly, but it's called the argument from authority. And the idea is that you accept a claim is true because it comes from an authority and an expert, not someone who's like a authoritarian, but an expert in the field. And that's okay reason. The main reason why we use it is because, well, can you be an expert in everything? No. No, because there's so much stuff to learn. I mean, way back in the time of like Aristotle or Confucius or somebody, a person like Aristotle or Confucius could claim to know all kinds of things. Aristotle was like a Greek biologist. He did physics, he did metaphysics, he did cosmology, in part because humans were just starting to build libraries and stuff. And so a person could know a lot of stuff. But today, could you read like all the books just in your field? Say you're in psychology. Could you read every book in psychology? No. No, if you spend every minute of every day reading, well, you'd die of starvation, but you couldn't get through it all. Even just reading like journal articles. So there's so much stuff. So we do have to rely on experts because we can't do everything ourselves. And so we do have to rely on them just because of practical concerns. Like we can't be a medical doctor, a auto mechanic, an engineer, a mathematician, an epidemiologist, a psychologist, an accountant. You have to rely on other people with other skills and hope they know what they're doing and are not lying to you. So how do you tell when you should maybe trust other people in terms of their authority, their expertise? Well, what you do is look to see if they're actually an expert. And this is very contentious, like weirdly contentious today. That, I mean, there's always been people who kind of doubted experts, and individualistic cultures, often say, they have doubts about so-called experts. But today it's especially important because it's become a very political issue. And some people, there's this weird kind of like anti-expert view that if a person is an expert, they weirdly should not be trusted for some reason. So this is all contentious now. So what do people say in philosophy about this? Well, this is what people in philosophy say. So to be an expert means what? If you're like a real expert, what do you get? Experience. Yeah, experience is a factor. And most fundamentally, when you're talking about something you're an expert in, you oh, probably know what you're talking about, hopefully. Yeah, so for someone who's got expertise, it's someone through experience or knowledge or skills, they have this understanding of a field, of an area of competence. Now, if someone's an expert, and we'll see what that means in a bit, and they're talking in their field, which can be ever narrower, their claims would be generally credible. Now, of course, defining a field can be kind of tricky because, like, let's take something like philosophy, which I know. People often ask me, "Oh, you're a philosopher. Do you know all about like Foucault or Derrida?" And I have to say no. And they're like, "Are you really a philosopher?" And I'm like, "Yeah, because we've been doing philosophy for thousands of years, and I just couldn't read it all. So I can't be an expert every single philosopher. I've heard of Derrida. I like read an article by him, but if someone said, tell me all about Derrida, I'd say I'm pretty sure he's dead. And he did deconstruction and stuff. Yeah, sure he's dead, actually. I didn't kill him. That's not what I'm sure, but I'm pretty sure he's dead. And the reason why is because even philosophy itself, you have areas of specialization and competence. Medicine is another good example. You might have a general practitioner, but people specialize heavily in eyes, nose, or ear, nose, and throat, or other parts of the body. So if someone's talking in their field, narrowly defined, and they're an expert, probably credible. If someone's an expert in one area and they're talking outside of their field, it doesn't mean they're wrong, but they gain no special credibility because we believe people who are experts in their field for good reason because they probably know that. If they're talking outside of the field, it doesn't mean they're wrong, but they probably don't know that. But do people often believe experts or even just celebrities when they're talking like outside of their field? Yes. Yeah, who's a good example? Who's somebody who talks about outside their field all the time? Famous guy. Put stuff in his face. Cars. Shot a car in his face.
Elon Musk.
Yeah, and when he talks, do people listen? Yeah, but what's his actual field? No one knows. He does money. He's a money guy. But when he talks about artificial intelligence or technology, people listen to him. But he's not an expert in artificial intelligence. He's not an expert in philosophy. But people pay a lot of attention to it. And there's some of like actors and athletes and stuff.
An expert in technology?
I don't think so. I think there was like someone raised the question like, what does he actually do? The main thing seemed to be like he's a money guy, but definitely check to see what he. I think he does hold a patent for the charger for Tesla. And I know he can't. He doesn't do all. I definitely know he doesn't have a degree in relevant to artificial intelligence or philosophy, but probably in something. Probably an expert in. I was going to say marijuana, but he did lay that up. So he does have his MD, his marijuana degree. That's a thing, right? Yeah, why not? That's a field of expertise. So if someone's talking outside of their field, doesn't mean they're wrong. I mean, Elon Musk could be right that we're all living in a simulation. Bill Gates can be right about his claims outside of his field. And it's, it could be correct. But if someone's talking outside of their field, you have no more reason to believe or doubt them than anybody else. So in talking about artificial intelligence, I would have like the same credibility as Elon Musk, maybe a little more because I do, philosophy of mind, etc. So I have a good background, but not too much. So that's kind of the test. So how do you tell when you've got an expert you probably maybe believe and versus one you probably shouldn't accept as credible? Now, when you go through this is also similar to what you kind of put on a standard resume. So when you're resumeing, you're trying to establish either that you are an expert or that you could become one. For example, running 2 job searches for faculty, and essentially this is what a CV, a curriculum vitae looks like. And if someone's if they know how to set up a good CV, they make all this stuff clear. Person's education, clearly relevant to experience, accomplishments, reputation, position, etc. And if you've done your own resume, you pretty much got this stuff on there. And as a pro tip, you probably already know this, but generally less is more. Because if someone's grinding through like lots of applications, and some people put everything on their CV or resume, it's like, oh God, yes, I know you can probably use Twitter. You don't have to list it. You can use Twitter and Microsoft Word, everyone can use Microsoft Word. And so generally, more, less is more. I mean, you definitely don't want to like undersell yourself, but generally if something's like just going on and on and on too much, it's too much. So how do you assess this stuff? Well, first is education. Now, obviously on like your resume, you put degrees earned. You'd also, of course, put things that would be formally provable education, things like certifications, specializations, etc. Things that can be documented from credible places. But can you learn things outside of like the academy? Yeah, so there can be things that are maybe harder to document, but the people can learn a lot of stuff that outside of academics or formal circumstances, and some of them don't really like have even like an corresponding academic field. You just kind of be an expert in it by doing it. Those are, of course, are harder to establish, but those would be legitimate qualifications. Being an expert in something based on education that may not have a degree attached to it, but having the appropriate education. Now, does having education guarantee expertise? No, there are institutions that are not accredited. People can buy degrees, and of course, people can pass and still maybe not know what they're doing. Hopefully not. So not a guarantee, but generally a plus. Second, experience. Generally, the more you do something, you get better at it. Typical. And so if someone has relevant experience, that's a plus. Which is why if you're constructing your own resume, you put in stuff that is relevant to experience. And when you're applying to particular jobs, you'd want to kind of like tailor both of these to the job. So if someone's applying to, say, a position in to be a psychology professor, and they had worked before as like in high school at Starbucks, I guess they could put that on there, but it really wouldn't be super relevant to that job. So you'd want to include experience that would be relevant. Does that guarantee expertise though? Could someone be doing something a long time and be really bad at it? Yeah. And there's also kind of effect that what can happen, it happens in school supposedly, everyone's probably heard of like senioritis, but if a person's in a field a long time, they might, if they don't keep up with it, if it's like a field that advances, which is pretty much all fields, they can get behind. And so they could have been in the field a long time, but they may not know like the more recent stuff. Or they might have just kind of like, given up on things. Next, accomplishments. And these would be, of course, relevant accomplishments. If the field is like awards or acknowledgements, etc. This would include things like in academics, things like publications. If someone is an artist, would be like doing shows, winning awards in art, similar things. Generally things that you could ideally be credentialed, you could prove. But do accomplishments guarantee expertise? No, because some of them could be like, there's always one thing to always consider is people are just making stuff up, they're just lying. But there are some accomplishments you may not know like what it actually entails to have like won this or done that. And there can be cases where people get things which would seem to show expertise, but if you look in the details, they do not. For example, favorite example is this. There was a professor, not here, not in school, who won a Teacher of the Year award. So if you were looking for a class to take, would you consider their class? Yeah, because a Teacher of the Year, that sounds good. Weirdly, this person had never taught our class. They were total research. They had like bought out their, at some research schools, you can buy out your teaching. Basically, you give the school money to pay you, and you do research instead of teaching. You can buy out, a certain amount. Now, weirdly, there was no requirement of the teacher in this teaching award to actually teach, strangely. And so they won the award. Now, why would someone want a teacher award who doesn't actually teach? Yeah, get a nice title. Plus, it came with a pay raise, which is always pretty sweet. And so the person wins this award, gets the pay raise and hadn't been teaching, because the weird thing is, again, there's apparently no requirement to actually teach. Now, generally, they do have that requirement, but you'd always want to check in accomplishments to see if they're real. And so if you're building up your CV to get a job, go to grad school, etc., you'd want to have relevant accomplishments to make yourself appealing. Next is reputation. And if a person has a positive reputation among other experts, that's a plus. So, for example, if you're trying to pick a doctor, and you have you know that, like, say, this one doctor, they're the doctor the other doctors go to. That's probably a good doctor. Yeah, probably, not guaranteed. That's how I picked my doctor. I found out from my friends who are doctors who they go to. I wouldn't pick a friend as a doctor because that would be like weird, weirdly awkward. I mean, if it's the only choice, then sure, but otherwise it's move on. So reputation plus. Businesses also, of course, try to establish their reputations. Now, does this though guarantee expertise? No, because reputations are not always like truly earned. Also, one practical thing is reputation is for like a particular time, and things can change. For example, I found this out the hard way myself. Years ago, I was getting my roof replaced, and people were like, yeah, this roofing company is really good, they're great. They replaced my roof, and then there was like expensive disaster. I was like, oh crap, what went wrong? And it turned out they were a really good company before, but now they had new like management and workers. So same name, but totally different thing. And so the reputation from the past was well deserved, but going at that point, not the case. So always good to check on reputation. Is it earned? Is it current? Now, in your own case, you'll want to establish reputation when you apply for jobs, grad school, etc. So when you're starting out, how do you convey to like a potential employer or grad school your reputation? What is the evidence you use for that? You can use test scores. Also, letters of recommendation is potentially their if you're going to employment or grad school, you try to get letters from people who are recognized and respected. And if they write you like a good letter, that's establishing your reputation. So if the grad school sees the professors credible and they say good things about you, then that's so good letters, good for jobs and grad school admission. Of course, the test scores, they like looking at numbers. So GPA, test scores, and if they're sorting between people or kind of bored, they'll look at other stuff. Lastly, position. Now, a person's like, typically like their job can reflect credibility. So if someone is, say, the head of Harvard's chemistry department, do they probably know chemistry? Probably, you know. Now, of course, does that guarantee expertise? Hopefully, but are there cases where people get jobs they're not really qualified? Yeah, it's called politics. Yeah, so people get into positions for various reasons, politics, nepotism, deception, etc., and not really be qualified at it. And probably encountered that from time to time. People who have a job and they really have no idea what they're doing. Not I mean like just starting out. I mean, it's a job they should hopefully know what they're doing. So these are all things that are pluses. Education, if you got it, right kind, plus experience, right kind, plus accomplishments, right kind, plus reputation, right kind, plus position, right kind, also plus. But again, these aren't guarantees. A person could have all of these and be wrong, either innocently wrong, just mistaken, or lying. A person could lack all these and still get things right. So believing a claim based on expertise is reasonable, but it's a very weak argument because you're basically saying, I think this person knows what they're talking about, and they're probably telling the truth, so they're probably right. But it's the only game in town because most of us are not going to go to medical school just to check up to make sure our doctor knows what they're talking about. We're not going to go and become an auto mechanic just to check on our auto mechanic to make sure they know what they're talking about. We're not going to become like an epidemiologist just to check on that stuff. So it's a practical matter, weak argument, but in most cases, it's unfortunately the only game in town. Now, so which experts, very practical question is, which expert should you agree with? Who should you listen to? Now, from the standpoint, this is disputed outside of philosophy, but among, kind of the consensus among critical thinker types and philosophers, etc., is that the majority opinion of the qualified experts is probably correct. Now, this is always qualified because it's qualified with, that they're qualified, also with they're probably right, because they could always be wrong. But if you're not an expert yourself, from a practical standpoint, the reasonable thing to believe is if the majority of experts have consensus. Why? Well, if most experts claim that something is true, then it's more likely to be true than no. Could they still be wrong? Oh yeah, totally. That's reality. So to use a concrete, political example, which has been politicized, vaccines. I'm not an expert in. I've got a PhD. I don't have an MD. If I had an MD, I wouldn't be a virologist, immune system expert, etc. But the overwhelming majority of experts say that vaccines are safe and effective. Could they be wrong? Yeah, sure. Anybody can be wrong about anything. That's how reality works. It's imperfect. And so I believe them, not because I'm an expert, because I'm totally not, but because the majority of experts say this is true. Again, they could be wrong. Now, when looking at it, you have to kind of look at the opposing thing. Like, if the majority say they work, and there's like one person or a few people who say they don't or they're dangerous, you have to look, are they actually experts? Do they have a stake in the matter? And then you have to ask the question, since I don't know myself, why should I pick the few over the many? Do I have a good reason? Now, it could be for like political reasons or emotional reasons, financial reasons, but from a logical standpoint, unless I'm an expert myself, I go with the majority because they're more likely to be right. They could always be wrong. That does happen, but they're more likely to be right than the numerical minority. And again, I used to ask people, why believe, the one person who says they don't work? And it comes down to basically that's how they feel. That's what they like. And which is not from a standpoint of critical thinking, not a great way to make decisions. Now, again, that's very contentious. There are people who, because everything has become politicized today, climate change, vaccines, science, etc. So it is controversial, but the logic seems pretty solid. The majority of people who know what they're talking about are more likely to be right than a small number of people who disagree, especially if they're have an interest in the matter or are not qualified. But all politics now, so not here. Now, what about cases where experts do disagree? And there are many cases where experts do disagree that can be frightening and confusing. For example, everyone remembers in the opening days of the pandemic, they had recommendations and then they change them and then change them again. And people were saying, these people don't know what they're talking about because they keep changing their mind. Well, at that point, yeah, they didn't. No one knew what they were talking about. So if the experts all disagree, the reasonable thing to do is go with the suspend judgment, to have no opinion. Because if it's something I'm not an expert on myself, which is everything except for a tiny bit of philosophy, then and the experts don't agree, I have no way of settling it. I don't know. Like, for example, there's discussion over, there's like 2 shots for someone to get a 3rd shot. Now they're talking about a 4th shot. Should we get the 4th shot? Hell if I know. Some people say, yeah. Some credible people. Other people say, no. I don't know. I'm not an expert in immunology, medicine, any of that stuff, so I have no idea. And so at this point, my view on 4th shot is no, because I'm not an expert and I'm totally unqualified to make a judgment. And so currently I'm at a no. If the majority of experts come out and say, oh yeah, we definitely need like a fourth shot, then I'd say, yeah, probably true. It could be wrong, but probably right. Now this can be, confusing and annoying because we often want certainty. And we often think that if people don't immediately have a definite answer, they don't know what the hell they're talking about. But complex things are complex. You don't always know for sure what's going on, and things can change, which is scary and confusing, especially like when it's things involving life and death. Now we turn to the news media. So, what is the media? Or what would be examples of the media? Well, some classic ones include what do people used to get delivered to their door? Newspapers. Yeah, newspapers. They still exist, far less now. And then after eventually people invented radio news, and then of course then you got the television, and then eventually of course you got the what was the big thing after TV? Besides like cable, etc. You got the internet, all that stuff. And then you get particular things like Facebook and the Twitter and Instagrams and the Telegrams and who knows what else. Yeah, so the media is this vast thing of putting information or lies out there. So since the media is where we get like all our non-super local information, and even a lot of local information, it's important to be aware of like, should you trust it? And the answer is generally like, as a general, probably not. Now, here are some concerns. Way back, there were some big networks. Like when I was a kid, we had ABC, NBC, CBS, and PBS, and then you had like affiliate stations. And then there was all kinds of different radio stations and newspapers, and they were like independently owned. And so there wasn't like one or a few people controlling that information. So you had like diverse sources. It was hard to check them all though, obviously, it was before the internet, so you really couldn't get like a radio. If you lived in Maine, you couldn't get a radio station from California, and you couldn't get even a TV station from like New Hampshire. But then eventually what happened is media just got like scooped up. So now everything is owned by very few companies. And kind of the problem with that is, well, when you have very few people or companies owning stuff, you have very limited sources of competing information. So it makes it easier for them to manage and control the news. Now, again, we still do have, media is, aside obviously from like PBS, is run, well, actually even PBS is run by private groups. But kind of the downside is if it's, everything is kind of controlled, you don't have that kind of competition. And if the people in charge want to send a particular message or cover up, certain things, they can do it on a pretty large scale. They can, the head of the company can say, we're pushing this or we're hiding that, and it spreads across the entire world, which is a lot of power. Now, I'm not saying they're automatically doing bad stuff, but if you wanted to do bad stuff, it would be super easy. Now, there's also governments, of course. In the old Soviet Union and the new Russia, infamously, of course, the government controlled.
So what did you say about media and consolidation of media that we should jot down?
Oh, it's essentially that ever fewer companies own like the media landscape. And now, I mean, for example, think of like Facebook. There's like Twitter, which is like some kind of competition, but essentially Facebook kind of rules the media landscape. In more traditional media, there are companies like Viacom, Disney that control vast swaths of that.
Like the radio.
Yeah, and in radio is most of it's owned by two companies owned it all. Yeah, it need not be automatically. Like, I'm not saying this automatically means they're being bad, but if they want to do bad things, it makes it super easy. Because if you're the CEO of a company that controls 25% of the media across the country, you can control a lot of stories. You decide what gets covered, what gets ignored, which can be quite significant. And we saw with Facebook, the effect of Facebook on the previous elections, etc. And so hugely influential. Which is why every once in a while they talk about like trying to break up, traditional media companies, and then they're talking now about breaking up Facebook, and Google, and other companies. Now, of course, we also have to worry about the government. As I mentioned, I remember when I was a kid, centuries ago, it was the Soviet Union, and everyone knew that the Soviet news, when it came to political stuff, it was controlled by the state. Similar to like China today, the news is supposed to control by the state. Obviously, North Korea controlled by the state. But even democracies like the United States, the government highly manages the news. In terms of, well, it's not like the government just like, in the United States at least, doesn't like yet seize, control of radio stations, and execute journalists. They kind of talk about doing that, kind of does yet. But the government can have a huge impact on the news. In the previous Trump presidency, it was pretty clear how Trump and Fox News and now OAN, how close they were, and how much influence the government had on news, and how much influence the news had on the government. You also, of course, get more subtle things. Like, for example, well, could you or I go to the White House, press thing and start asking questions like, "Hey, Joe, how are the dogs?" No, you have to get like a special pass. And who decides who gets the pass? They decide who gets the pass. So your ability to access politicians, the most extreme example, the president, depends on them. So generally, they're pretty good about letting the big players there But they decide. And if someone's, considered like asking too tough questions, they just don't get, they don't get asked questions, or they don't get invited. So there's various, kind of subtle ways to do that. Now, the government has in the past, and this is both the Democrats and Republicans, they'll send out, manufactured, but kind of pre-made stories to push programs, etc. And so the government does have a lot of influence on the news. Also licensing, they decide who can have licenses, the broadcast, etc. And again, we're not like, North Korea, the old Soviet Union, but it's worth considering how much influence the state has on the news. The media, of course, made up of people. People make mistakes. If anybody here is in journalism, that's still a thing. I heard that like news was dead. But one of the things that I assume they cover journalism classes is things like that go wrong. And sometimes media folks, journalists get stories wrong. Yeah, because people are human. And of course, people can lie to the journalists. They, when news is kind of breaking, it's a mess, it's confusing. You don't know what's happening. And so people can mess things up. Also, sometimes the media will get like a little too excited to go after someone. One of the most famous ones, there's this guy, Dan Rather. He was kind of the protege of Walter Cronkite. Walter Cronkite was like the most trusted man in America. He was a news guy. And Dan Rather was also really trusted until he got too excited about going after George Bush, Bush 2, and basically ended up just like wrecking his career. He put too much faith in something that wasn't properly documented. And so we do get examples of cases where the media makes a mistake. Now, of course, we have many cases where they're just making stuff up, and more so, today, people can just straight up lie and claim it's news. But there are cases where mistakes occur. Sometimes it's corrected, but often not. Now, what's more interesting and controversial is, of course, the alleged bias. Now, going after the media and saying the media is liberal bias is actually pretty, well, it's both recent and old. It's recent in the sense that, in terms of like all human history, because it goes back to basically Nixon. Remember Nixon? I'm not a crook, he's totally a crook. And as he admitted it, he just left office. He didn't actually get impeached because he just kind of left.
Resigned before getting impeached.
Yeah, smart move. Go out on top. Or they couldn't impeach him. And his vice president was big at going after putting the notion that the media is biased. And later, Ronald Reagan, and ever since then, it's been kind of a talking point among conservatives that the media is liberal enough to get that really, like when Obama was president, Fox News would talk about how much the media was all for Obama, which is kind of ironic because they were totally against Obama, but talking about how the media is totally for it, except of course for him. And so one of the narratives is the media is left biased, out to get conservatives, and it's bad. Now, is the media biased? Well, in a way, yes. In a way, it's a very vague question because it depends on who you're talking about. It's like asking if men are tall. I mean, yes, some. So it's such a general thing that yeah, it's probably true in general, but you really got to get into the particulars. So the rational thing to do here would be to look at the particular media and even break it down, even at the level of like shows and hosts, because there's obviously things that are just purely editorial and identified as such. They're technically not like news, and they can give opinions, which is to say they can lie quite a bit, and they have varying degrees of bias. So, for example, and also depends, clearly on the context, and there's varying degrees. For example, Rachel Maddow, biased? Oh, I mean, when she reports on bad stuff happening to Trump, does she seem happy? Anybody know Rich Mano? MSNBC. She's also on YouTube. But yeah, she seems like there's like kind of the newscaster phase in which you're trying to be kind of like neutral presenting stuff. But when bad things are happening to Trump, she seems pretty happy about that. Which of course is a bit of a bias. I mean, even if you are happy about that as if you're a newscaster, you'd probably be like more neutral. Tucker Carlson. You ever heard of him? Fox guy, biased. Oh, yeah, super biased. John Hannity, super biased. And there are new like news agencies that are just dedicated to being biased. Now, this does kind of ironically, the right news agencies do seem more sort of like explicitly biased. But if you do watch like the so-called liberal media, they do also seem somewhat perhaps biased. And of course, it doesn't help when they seem like it seems kind of bad when they're really gleeful about like bad stuff happening to conservatives, because it makes them look like they've got, it makes them look like they've got an interest in it. So as a general rule, yeah, the media is probably biased. There are people, there are some that are explicitly have a political agenda, specifically created for that. But you want to break it down based on, particular thing, the network, even down to the show, to the particular host or news anchor level, because that can vary quite a bit. They have varying degrees of credibility. Like if someone seems like really enjoying reporting on, say, something bad happened to Trump, and they're just doing a news anchor thing, yeah, that may show some bias. Or if someone is always totally praising Trump, then bias as well. So one should always be critical of the media, more so, of course, of those that seem more and more biased. Now, a lot of the factual stuff, neutral stuff, is probably mostly accurate. Things that, in a way, in a sense, things that don't matter, probably accurate. Weather reports, probably kind of accurate. Basic factual stuff, generally kind of accurate. Although even now, even basic factual stuff is probably up for grabs. So, controversial matter. The right says the left rules the media is totally biased. The left claims that the right rules like Fox News and other things, and they're totally biased, and definitely a lot of biased media. So the thing to do is always apply the general critical thinking skills, especially being aware of one's own bias. So if someone like leans left, they shouldn't just watch MSNBC and they maybe get some more neutral, more right-leaning news. Likewise, if someone's a conservative, they probably shouldn't just listen to OAN and Fox News and John Hannity and Tucker Carlson. They should probably take a look on the elsewhere too to get more diversity. So the idea is basically definitely be critical. Now, the biggest bias that all media has, of course, is making money, because it's a business. That's a non-political one, and it does influence, how they cover stories, what approaches they take, because they don't want to hurt the money. Cable news. Long ago, before CNN, there used to be like an hour of news. Like you could watch your local news, 30 minutes roughly, then your national news, 30 minutes. And if you were like super into news, you could watch some PBS and get like another hour of news. But how much news can you get today? Yeah, and then some, more than you want, more than you need, more than you should have. Yeah, because it's 24-hour cable news. CNN started it, becoming kind of a dominant stake in airports, and then later news channels started doing it. And of course, now we have news on Facebook and Instagram, and Twitter, and YouTube, and so it's a constant flow. Now, this of course has some impacts. One impact is that you got to fill 24 hours, which means you get a lot of lot of garbage as well. So originally kind of the idea was the 24 hours to cover, to fill out, they could do like in depth and have all kinds of like, careful analysis, etc. And some stations do. I mean, like PBS does a lot of that stuff. Some of the news channels do like bigger things, but a lot of it's like really, a lot of really kind of like shallow stuff. Now, being cable doesn't mean it's like automatically wrong. It just means with all that stuff to fill up, you get a lot of garbage. So generally, the media thing to do is obviously be critical, especially when a news agency, news show, an anchor matches your own biases. They should be especially critical because it's real easy to believe things that you want to believe, whether one is on the left or the right. So if someone's watching Fox News and they believe, that Antifa was behind January 6th, and they hear Tucker Carlson talking about that, they'll tend to believe it. And if someone's on the left and they hear somebody on the left talking about something that Donald Trump did, they'll tend to just believe it. And so we have to be on guard against our biases. Now, there's other stuff in the media, talk radio, which is spread to the internet. Used to be Rush Limbaugh before he died. He was a famous one. Now you have, what's his name? Seth Rogen, is that right? That guy? The InfoWars guy, Alex Jones. They do kind of, it's kind of TV, radio-ish. Now, in general, same rules apply. If they're clearly presenting ideology and agenda, it lowers their credibility. And of course, you should always be critical, especially if it matches your own biases. Now, the internet. Who regulates the internet to make sure that the stuff out there is true and good? Yeah, no. I mean, countries like China and the US, etc., do some censorship, but it's pretty much on the plus side. The internet is like the mythological Wild West. You can go there, you can recreate yourself and be whoever you, which in a way is good because it means anybody with access to a computer can get their message out. They can create web pages, they can get on the Instagrams and Facebooks, etc. And so anybody with something to say can say, which if you believe in free expression, good thing. The curse of the internet is, of course, the exact same thing, that anybody can say anything. So you get a lot of garbage out there. Now, with like news channels, they sometimes have like some accountability because they have like a corporate office and you can be critical of like the BBC, for example, they have a whole complaint system. But the internet, in a way, you can kind of go, like if someone's doing stuff on Facebook, you can kind of complain to Mark Zuckerberg. But in general, people can do whatever they want within the limits of what the states, countries are willing to allow them. And so you want to be like extra critical, obviously, on the internet, because anybody can say anything. And so there's some, as you all know, there's some really good stuff out there. And there's some really like awful, dangerous stuff. Wikipedia. Generally good. Yeah, I mean, some professors, I remember like when Wikipedia first came out, some professors like made a point like, do not use Wikipedia. And I was like, go ahead, use Wikipedia. Because generally with most stuff, it's pretty good. I mean, it's not like deep or anything, but it's a fine starting point. There's nothing, as long as you double check to make sure, someone's not like altered things or made things up, it's generally a pretty good source. I'm also biased. I went to grad school with Larry Sanger, who was one of the co-founders of Wikipedia. And that's as close as I got to being famous. Because he asked me for advice in grad school, and I said, always have a backup career. So there you go. So I have like a 1 billionth responsibility for the Wikipedia.
I got one question about the previous slide.
Oh, sure.
What was the advice about the media?
Generally, approach it the same way you would approach any claim, Well, kind of like extra skepticism, especially in cases which is most difficult when it matches your own sort of like biases and beliefs. And it's just as a practical thing, it's good to, if possible, see if you can find like another credible source, or hopefully more credible source, to kind of counterbalance. Of course, one challenge is finding like a neutral source in this vast sea of clearly biased media. Who you trust.
What did you say for advocacy for TV?
Oh, these are essentially, it's sort of merged into like internet and stuff too. Basically, these are TV shows that do have they're pushing like an agenda. A good example of this, like in the past, comedy shows. Some comedy shows famously do this. When Colbert Report was a thing years ago, he was a left-winger pretending to be a right-wing pundit. And even though, of course, it was comedy, he was definitely pushing a pretty left agenda. The Daily Show, which is still a thing, has generally been pretty left. And although it's comedy, it's generally, I mean, they do criticize people on the left because they often do stupid stuff, but it's generally kind of a left-leaning show. Samantha Bee, another example, former Daily Show. She's a comedian, but clearly very left. Her videos have a very political agenda. And it's interesting that it's often comedy shows that are presenting themselves as comedy, but they do clearly have a political leaning. So while, for example, Samantha Bee is doing comedy, she's also definitely advocating for things like abortion rights, voting rights, the nationalization of women, etc. So she's comic, but also doing really pushing what we consider like left politics, like being able to vote, etc. Sure. And those you should be critical about, double critical, because if it's like funny, then you're, as Plato argued, you're kind of off your guard when you're listening to comedy because you're not expecting like people to be really pushing stuff. So it's good to be like extra critical of them because it's sort of like, oh, that's funny. And Plato argued that comedy can influence you very strongly without you realizing things that you heard in a very, a non-comedic, manner, just kind of presented, as an argument step by step. You might just say, well, no, that doesn't work. But if you hear it like in the context of comedy, you might find it much more appealing. And in general, the left is much better at comedy than the right, typically. Not to say that conservatives can't be funny, and there are some interesting analysis of why the left comedians, the most successful comedians, tend to be more like left, at least doing like politics, and that when people try to do like political right-wing comedy, it's generally less successful. I mean, there are funny conservatives, but it seems like the argument has been that conservative humor is not as funny.
But like the Simpsons, would it just be like
Yeah, that could work too, because yeah, cartoons, especially comedic ones, like so like Simpson, Family Guy, American Dad, those can all have kind of messages. Like Simpsons, they're kind of left, and they do it comically, also with cartoons, but they do often have like kind of a clear political lean to them. Yeah, good point. And I clearly wouldn't say that like it's wrong to do that, because it's often like interesting stuff or funny, but one should, as Plato warned us, we should be on guard against that kind of stuff, because if they are presenting like a political ideology, we should be believing stuff based on good reasons and not just because somebody's like funny or entertaining. Advertising. So advertising, quite a thing. In fact, it's always been like a big thing in the media, because newspapers, back when they had those things, Ads, lots of ads. It's how they get they got a little money selling subscriptions, but the big amount of money was advertising. Same with television. TV was, before cable, TV was free. They literally just blasted out everywhere. You could just get free TV and free radio. And so the way they made their money was, of course, selling advertisements. They would sell some of their time, so you'd have to listen to someone selling like soap or whatever. And that's kind of the price you paid for your free TV or free radio. Same with like then with the rise of like the Google, Facebook, Facebook also makes money selling information to other things. Interesting story there. But Google, of course, was like the first mega ad seller in a way. That's their primary source of, it was the primary source of revenue. Yeah, so advertising is huge. Now, the main purpose of advertising, kind of jokingly, but actually seriously, is its function is to turn off your brain and get your money, essentially. So you'll buy something. So how do you approach advertising critically? Well, kind of the spoiler is generally don't believe ads. I mean, that's, we all kind of know this, but here's how to approach them, critically. So the question is, from the standpoint of the authors of the book, the key question is, does this ad give us a good reason, good logical reason to buy this product? Now, there are a variety of reasons to buy stuff. And the authors, I think, come up with a pretty good, like, buy, don't buy guide, which is this. Will I be better off with this product than without? Also considering, would I be better off like using the money for something else or keeping it or investing? So kind of the most rational way to approach buying stuff is that fundamental question. If I take my money and I get the thing or the service or whatever, will this make my life better? Now, in some cases, of course, it'll be something you got to do, like food. Yeah, I mean, the answer there is kind of like, yeah, it makes you not die, so that's good. So that's kind of the test. Now, the practical problem there is, how do we know if we'll be better off or no? I mean, in some cases, basic stuff like food, shelter. Yeah, you're better off having food than not having food. Better off like being inside a structure than being out in the woods. But when it comes to other stuff, how do you know? And most ads try to make us feel that we would be better off, that our life would improve, often dramatically, revolutionary improvement if we just buy that new phone or that new software or that new car. Now, there are basically two types of ads, generally speaking. There are those that do give reasons and those that don't. By far, the most common are those that don't. Now, right away, of course, the answer to the question, does this ad give us a good reason to buy the product? If it doesn't give reasons, the answer is automatically no. So from a logical standpoint, any ad that's not like, in a way, arguing with you, automatically like fails. You shouldn't believe. I'm not saying you should think that it's lying, but you should automatically just say, well, no reasons given, no reason to believe these claims. So they rely heavily, as you might imagine, on psychological factors. So common examples would include celebrities showing people who like or want to be like or respect using the product or endorsing it. The classic celebrity ad or beautiful person ad. Then there are cases where they show the product in circumstances that we suppose would like. Corona does a really good job. So we're very familiar with the Corona ads, the beer. Yeah, they always show like a person like in some place really nice. And then of course the idea is that Corona, if you drink enough of it, you'll feel you're at the beach, even when you're in the office. At a meeting. And so they try to, or like with cars, they try to show like your lifestyle be like better, more dramatic, more beautiful, etc. There are also ones that rely on emotional appeals like comedy, and there are some ads that are hilarious. They're really, they're short bits of like artistry. And there, of course, there are some that do like really strong emotional appeals. And with the Super Bowl coming up, you'll get a chance to see, the latest crop of multi-million-dollar ads. And most of them will tend to like, they'll try to be, in some cases, funny, which sometimes work. Try to be like heartwarming, which sometimes work. And then, of course, there are some that just become, they're kind of like incomprehensible. You might have seen these ads, you're like, look at them, and you're like, I don't know what they're trying to sell me or what is even going on here. I don't know. There was like one time ad I saw, I did look up like the company because I wonder what they were even doing. So I guess that worked. I didn't realize that was they doing, so I'm gonna do that again. Now, all those ads, of course, can be entertaining to watch, they may be hilarious, heartwarming, etc. But of course, do they give us a reason to logically buy the product? No, I mean, the mere fact that say Ryan Reynolds, owns Mint, doesn't give us a logical reason to switch to that company. If they show a celebrity drinking Gatorade, it doesn't give us a logical reason to drink Gatorade. If they have an advertisement for Budweiser that involves the story of a really heartwarming story about a horse, good story, but it doesn't give us a reason to drink logically drink Budweiser. So all those ads, of course, fail on that count. Ads that give us no reasons, give us no reasons. They can still be worth watching for other reasons, because again, some of them are really good. They're hilarious or very touching. An entire movie in just a matter of seconds, and that takes a lot of artistry to tell that kind of story or create that kind of humor in that short amount of time. Now, the other type of ads are those that actually do give us reasons. They attempt to, in a way, argue, not like in a bad way, they say like, this is why you should buy the product. This is kind of a very common in like, often in like tech areas and automobiles, etc. Like, for example, they might try to get you to buy a hybrid car and give you reasons like, well, what's the main reason to get a hybrid? Besides, making a statement. Yeah, in theory, you save money on gas. Be a practical reason. So they might say, buy the new, hybrid. They'll say a thing like drivers save an average of blah 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 per year. And of course, that does give you reason. Similar with like software or technology, they might say every time I phone like a new, Apple or AMD or telecom up with a new thing, it's always, it's always faster. It's always like a memory or some other, fancy features. And the idea is you're supposed to buy it for those reasons. And it is giving you reasons. So if like the new Apple computers have like a faster processor in it, a higher resolution screen, more memory, those would all be reasons they're given. But even those ads, they're still ads, which means they suffer from the fatal flaw of the people presenting the ad are, of course, biased. And of course, we know that ads are ambiguous and vague. The companies obviously biased, they're trying to sell the product. And although they technically can't like totally lie in most cases, they're not really very strictly regulated in terms of the truth. So the end result is kind of what you probably suspected all along. The ads, even as they give you reasons, still give you no logical reason because they're utterly biased source. Now, there is, however, like one exception. One thing the ad can tell you that is can be kind of the closing reason and all the reasons. And that is that the product you're looking for does exist. So if you have reasons to buy something of your own, and the missing piece is, does that product exist? Then seeing the ad showing the product exists, that does give you the final bit of reason, namely the product exists. And if you have already have good reasons to acquire it, knowing that it exists makes it, that's the bit. So for example, I had good reasons to get an adapter for my iPhone so I can plug it into this computer so I don't have to lug that laptop around all the time. And I suspected that such a product existed, but then I was able to confirm it, of course, on Amazon, trying to sell me one. And then, yeah, that advertisement gave me a reason, because what I cared about was, does the thing I already want that I have reasons to get, does that exist? And the answer is, well, yes, it does, as advertised on Amazon. So in general, ads give you no logical reason to buy the product, not surprisingly. So chapter 4 recap. So the important stuff of chapter 4, and this concludes part 1. So when we're assessing claims, we look at, do they match our observations? If the answer is, as you saw before, if they do, plus, if they don't, minus, etc. Then we looked at the expertise today, and those are the key points to 4. And then we wrapped up this stuff today. So before ending, the next time we'll go on to part 2. And so in terms of like the test, quiz, and assignments, here's the end of part 1. Before ending, anything about part 1 or chapter 4 in particular that needs more stuff?
I got more questions about grouping.
Hmm?
What do you mean by grouping?
Oh, grouping ambiguity?
It's like grouping the grouping like different things together. I'm not pretty sure.
Was it, well, we did look at grouping ambiguity, which was about, that's ambiguity where it's not clear whether you're talking about something individually or collectively, or comparing individual to individual or collective to collective. Yeah, so that distinction is, so grouping ambiguity occurs if someone says something like, tigers eat more than people, and it's ambiguous because it's not clear if they're talking about individual tigers, individual human, or talking about collective, like adding up everything tigers eat and everything humans eat, and comparing that group to group. Or as another example, if someone says that retail workers make more than doctors, also ambiguous, pretty clear what they mean, but it's not clear from what it said whether it means retail worker compared to a doctor individually, or if you added up all the salaries of everyone. In that case, individual is definitely not true. Collectively, maybe true, because there's a lot of retail workers. Yes, the grouping ambiguity was about whether it's talking about things as a collective, as a group, or individual, either comparing them individual to individual, or group to group, or just talking about them in that manner, either as individuals or a group. No?
It does.
Okay, so have a good rest of the day, and I'll see you in the future.